A warm greetings to everyone. Today we take up for discussion a question that's often in the minds of Christians. I'm sure this also in the minds of others, especially if they are aware of Jesus' teaching that we should seek perfection. This question is based on the 48th verse of the 5th chapter of the Gospel according to St. Matthew. Jesus says, "Be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect." Surely an exalted order. Now the question is this feasible? Is it possible at all for human beings to be perfect? Is not perfection something exclusively attached and ought to be attached only to God? Can human beings be perfect? Is there any sense in Jesus saying be perfect? So this is a question, and I'm sure it's a question that everybody who is human is interested in. Now, before I enter into a discussion based on this question, I have a request to make, and that is, questions like this involve the whole of our spiritual life. These are not questions that can be answered in an yes or no format. It takes its own space to answer. Therefore, I beg of you to be patient and to participate in this process of seeking together to the end. So let's get started. What is the question? The question is it possible for human beings to be perfect? To be perfect? So the question is it possible to be perfect? So that's a simple question. Let's fix it clearly and firmly in our minds so that this will be the lodestar that guides our journey together. Now let's begin by taking note of the two very interesting and somewhat enigmatic facts about our attitude to perfection. First of all, as a two enigmatic and interesting aspects to our attitude to perfection. First of all, we admire perfection in others. If you look at all the icons that humanity cherishes, you'll find that they were all perfect in their own ways. I don't want to cite examples and consume our time. I'm sure many examples will come to your mind readily. So we admire perfection in others, but we are very skeptical. In fact, we are even fearful about pursuing perfection for ourselves. Perfection is a very good thing in others, but it's a burden, a load, too heavy, too crushing for me to carry. This is by and large the outlook. Perhaps I can summarize this attitude very easily or perhaps very crisply by quoting the words of G.K. Chesterton, who said, "We are willing to walk 100 miles to see a great man, but we will never pray that God may fill our hearts with the same greatness." Period. I think nothing more needs to be said about this. So this is a first very interesting and enigmatic aspect of our outlook on perfection. The second aspect is, and this is of course very universal, it may not have to be explained, we do seek perfection, but it's only cosmetic perfection or perfection in appearance. Now, in physical terms, everybody knows how the cosmetic industry flourishes in the world because everyone wants to look better than one really is. Right? And the same thing about the masks that we wear in public. After all, the word personality is derived from the Latin root persona, which means a mask. So personality is the mask that we wear in public so that others may think that we are better than what we really are. So this is what I mean by cosmetic perfection. So this cosmetic perfection recommends itself readily to every human being. One aspect of this is flattery. When somebody flatters us, they are not really, he or she is not telling us the truth about ourselves. The truth about ourselves we know. Flattery is made up of the substance of perfection that we did not pursue, but we would like to believe that we have nonetheless. So that is somewhat the idea of perfection. So therefore, having now fixed these two interesting aspects of our outlook on our attitude to perfection, namely that we are very happy to admire perfection in others, but we do not want to seek perfection because we think it is too much of a botheration for us. That's number one. Number two, even so we seek perfection, but it's only one worldly model of, physical model of perfection, which is cosmetic perfection, or perfection only in appearance and not perfection in reality. So this much is absolutely clear to us. Now let's go further. When Jesus says be perfect, surely he's pointing to a fundamental reality about the human condition. Perhaps the most important thing about the human condition is that it is full of choices. In every given situation, there will be at least two options between which we can choose. There will be many more options, but at the very least, there will be two major options between which we can choose. Either we choose this way or we choose the other way. And the irreducible fact about human condition is that the moment you choose one way, you renounce the other. You cannot have both. It's either or. So Jesus is highlighting this fundamental reality about the human condition, namely that there is a choice to make. Secondly, also you are free to make that choice. Nobody in the world can rob you of this freedom. Many people say, oh, I'm not free, and this, that, and the other. But the fact of the matter is that you have this freedom, the freedom to choose between these two ways or these two orientations on life. That's what we need to understand. So therefore, every human being in this world, irrespective of under which kind of dictatorship or tyranny a person lives politically, every human being in this world is absolutely free to make a choice between these two fundamental orientations of life. And Jesus talks about it in greater detail in the 7th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, verses I think 13 and 14, where he says there is this way, the narrow way and the broad way. The narrow way is the way that leads to perfection, and that's also the way to everlasting life. Whereas the broad way, which is the way of living by expediency, living by convenience, living by instincts, living by the general standards that prevail, while in Rome, behave like Romans, that kind of thing. That's the broad way. And the end of that journey is utter futility, frustration, and heartbreak. So now I said there are two options. In order to make this idea clear, let me take a biblical example. As I've always said, I base my thoughts, insights entirely on biblical texts, and particularly the teachings of Jesus Christ. So in order to understand the two options which are real with respect to every aspect, every instance of human life, let's take one specific instance, namely hospitality. Now the hospitality that Martha practiced and the hospitality that Mary practiced. Now the interesting thing here is, in the house of Bethany, there are two contrasting models of hospitality. Jesus visits their home. It's Martha who receives Jesus into the house, but soon after receiving him, Martha disappears into the kitchen. Thereafter you hear only the rattling of the kitchen utensils. In the meanwhile, something far more beautiful, something incomparably beautiful and meaningful is in progress elsewhere in the house. That is, Mary is sitting at the feet of Jesus, learning of him the immortal truths of life. Two completely different models of hospitality. We often don't realize that hospitality is as much about receiving as about giving. Actually, I would say that receiving is more fundamental to hospitality than giving. We have to receive the other. How do we receive the other? We must receive the other in relation to who that person is. There is no point in receiving a saint exactly as you would receive a minister or a politician. It would be an insult to the saint to extend the sort of extend to him the sort of hospitality that you would extend to a politician. So, and that's why I say that the more fundamental aspect of hospitality is receiving the other, accepting the other. So, Martha, on the other hand, is a slave to the prevailing stereotype about hospitality. Every society has its own norms, its own understanding of how hospitality must be practiced. Martha has very faithfully imbibed it, and she is zealously practicing the social norm. The consequence is that she lives burdened by these social notions. The burden of life is an issue that Jesus addresses in a very focused manner. Please read the 28th verse of the 11th chapter of Matthew's Gospel. This is not the occasion for me to take that text up for detailed discussion. So, in that context, Jesus says something very profound and very beautiful and very simple. He says to Martha, 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 only one thing is needful, only one thing is necessary. You're running after and you're burdened with so many things. You are leading a scattered and divided existence, which is a burden in itself. Your life is a burden, not only your hospitality. This is how a majority of people in this world turn their life into unbearable burdens. Therefore, these texts have to be really meditated upon and explicated to people in light of contemporary human condition. So, the point that there are two options between which we can and must choose is what I wanted to illustrate through the different approaches to the practice of hospitality between the two sisters in the same house. And that's the beauty of it. Martha and Mary growing up in the same space, living in the same space, but harboring two completely contrary approaches to the practice of hospitality. Now, let's consider a couple of instances more, because this is an idea so fundamental to my argument that I think it is justifiable to acquaint ourselves with two further illustrations in the Gospels so that we attain clarity about what we are talking about. Now think of the Last Supper. Again, the idea is this, that in every situation with respect to everything and everyone, there are at least two options between which, or two models between which we can choose. Think of the Last Supper. Now, I was talking about the hospitality that Martha, two different models of hospitality that Martha and Mary practiced. Now, as a continuation of that, let's look at the hospitality that Jesus practiced. The hospitality that Jesus practiced is remembered today as the Last Supper. The Last Supper, which people forget, is nothing but a celebration of hospitality by the rabbi towards his own disciples. The Guru and his disciples, the Master and his disciples. There's a Master's hospitality to the disciples. That's a simple way of understanding the Last Supper. Now, consider this. This is the most beautiful thing I can ever imagine. In the course of this fellowship meal, the celebration of the Guru's hospitality to his disciples, Jesus takes up the ordinary, everyday things of life. Bread and wine. Now, bread and wine was an integral part of the ordinary life of the Jews. There was nothing supernatural about it. Nobody looked at a loaf of bread and said, oh, wonderful spiritual object. Nobody looked at a glass of wine and said, oh, it is red with spiritual possibilities. Nobody did that. Everybody handled it in a very mechanical manner. Nobody even bothered to think about it even for a fraction of a second. Right? Jesus takes up such ordinary, routine, familiar objects or things. And then what happens? It makes them immortal. He immortalizes them. Even today, the bread and the wine continue, not just in the Jewish culture, but in every culture of the world. Wherever the Christian presence is, the bread and wine, they continue to come alive again and again and again in the life of the people. Now, what is the difference? The difference is the idea of perfection. If you are seeking perfection, if you are oriented to perfection, it doesn't matter what you handle. Everything gets transformed in your hands. Now, the degree of which will vary because the degree of perfection would vary. Jesus, being the Son of God, would attain a degree of perfection which perhaps we will never attain. Doesn't matter. Now, here I want to introduce a very basic idea in the discipline of seeking perfection, and namely, now you look at that text. Jesus says, "Be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect." Now, a very simplistic and inappropriate way of understanding that teaching is, be perfect like God. That is not what Jesus means. It's a perversion, it's a misinterpretation of the words of Jesus. What he means is this: God is perfect in God's own way. Be perfect in your own way. But your own way must be part of God's own way as it applies to you, because you are a child of God, you are a creation of God. God has created you and invested in you a particular purpose, a great potential. Seek perfection in relation to that core essence of your being as a unique human being. That's a teaching. Why does it have to be taught? Because universally people neglect it. We allow ourselves to be distracted by the cheap things of the world. We are always chasing the vain shadows of the world, and therefore we are remaining strangers to ourselves. That is why the question, "Who are you?" is the most difficult question for everyone to answer. If someone were to ask you this question, "Who are you?" what would you say? Perhaps you would stare in incomprehension or embarrassment or in a state of wonderment and puzzle, confusion. Now, that is the issue. So therefore, when Jesus touches these ordinary things of life, they become transformed. So from you, the power of perfection flows into the material world and gives it a beauty, a power, a nourishment, a potentiality that it would otherwise never have. That actually is the meaning of the sacrament. But it is nowhere in the teachings of the church. People who celebrate the Lord's Supper as commemorative of the Last Supper do not know this at all. I challenge. The meaning of the sacrament is not understood. Okay, that's not my main subject, therefore I'm going to take leave of this. Let me take another example. Now, as I go into the next example, let's carry the essence of what I've said about the first illustration, that is the Lord's Supper or the Last Supper, namely, if you are perfect, that perfection impacts everything that you handle, and therefore even the ordinary things of life assume a spiritual dimension, a glow, a spiritual glow that it would otherwise never have. Now, to give you an example of this, if you go to the Sabarmati ashram, which is hallowed by the presence of, by the memories about Gandhi, you will find two objects on display. One is a pair of wooden clocks, that is the indigenous substitute for slippers, and an old worn out toothbrush. They are preserved as national treasures. Why? Because they were used by Mahatma Gandhi. That's what I mean. Okay. Now let's look at the second illustration. Very familiar, Jesus and the woman of Samaria, chapter 4 of John's Gospel. Now the interesting thing to note here is that before this woman came into contact with Jesus, the man of perfection, she had already come into contact with six others, 5 husbands you have had already. The one you're living with now is not your husband. So 6 there. What happened to her? Through her exposure to these six men who are all stuck in imperfection, her life, her personality was being regularly degraded. She was losing her self-worth. She's been reduced to rubbish. Then finally, she comes into contact, by the design of God, I believe, with Jesus. What happens? Her worth resurrects. She becomes a new creation. This is actually the deep secret of the idea of spiritual transformation. Transformation is nothing but the reorientation of human beings from seeking imperfection to seeking perfection. Perfection in relation to who they are meant to be in the plan of God. So, the essence of perfection is therefore, if you're perfect, what will you do? You will respond to the given situation or to the person who you are relating to in terms of what is lacking in that situation and person in order to make up for it. That is the outworking, the practical outworking of perfection. This is a big thought in itself, but let me not linger on with this. Let's move on. Now, to be able to attain this level of transformative presence, one has to grow. It is too simple. It's too obvious. It may not be simple, but it's too obvious. How can you become a transformative influence on anyone if you're shriveled and shrunk like Zacchaeus? Look at the personality of Jesus. That was a wonder of wonders. Now, what is the benchmark? The benchmark is that this body on the cross, crucified and writhing in pain, is seen by the Roman centurion, and he cannot but exclaim, truly, this man is the Son of God. That's the power of personality. That is the power of perfection and personality. And that is what Jesus is saying. Jesus is not just uttering some nice words. He is articulating the very heart of the human condition, possibilities, and the potential glory of being human. So, now therefore we have to grow, and if you really study the teachings of Jesus Christ, you'll realize that every one of his teachings is pointing towards the need for human beings to grow. Again, a subject that needs to be addressed, but on another occasion. Now, therefore, the alternative to seeking perfection or being perfect, in the sense that we have understood so far, is condemnation. And Jesus makes it amply clear through the parable of the talents. There, the two ideas that I have dealt with so far become very clear. Namely, the servant who got 5 talents needed to produce 5 talents more, but the servant who got only 2 talents needed to produce only 2 talents more. That's why I'm saying you're required to be perfect only in relation to what you're already entrusted with or what you have been made to be by God. The second insight is, and that's what I'm coming to, if you don't therefore pursue perfection, what happens? What's the outcome? What's the alternative? It is to invite condemnation upon yourself. And the third servant in the parable, who went and buried his talent, which is the rejection of the path of perfection and the option or the choice to languish in the status quo. It's a beautiful metaphor of languishing in the status quo. The third servant is prisoner of the status quo. He doesn't want any change. He says, I'll return the talent as it is to the master when he comes. So that path is the path to condemnation and misery. Now, Christians meditate the cross at least once a year. That's Good Friday. But I have attended many meditations on the cross on Good Fridays, but I've heard nobody say that the cross is the ultimate affirmation of the validity of seeking perfection. Now, it's because Jesus sought perfection and attained it, or is it because Jesus exemplified perfection in relation to the human, that the cross, which was an object of abhorrence, the most hated object in history, became so hallowed in the spiritual life of Christians, indeed of the world. That is the part. It's the same part that we have already seen in the context of the Last Supper that Jesus celebrated with his disciples. So therefore, the outcome, now how do you know that you're oriented to perfection or not? Now this is very important and useful to understand this. The hallmark of a person who is oriented to perfection and is taking small timid steps in that direction is that his life is illumined with joy. The byproduct of pursuing perfection is joy, happiness, ecstasy, bliss. the byproduct of rejecting that path and taking to the path of languishing in the status quo of imperfection is condemnation and misery. Or in the words of the Bible, or in the words that Jesus himself uses, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. These are metaphoric statements. Weeping and gnash doesn't mean that all the time. Literally, you are gnashing your teeth. So, a state of misery. So, the outcome or the personality of a person who is oriented to perfection is that his personality is illumined with happiness. The second aspect of his personality, and the second blessing of pursuing perfection, is that it liberates us from the oppression of circumstances. Most people live as victims of circumstances. Now you ask them why they did certain stupid things or aberrant things, they will say, well, circumstances forced me to do. In law, people talk about circumstantial evidence. In psychology, people talk about the atmospheric stimulations to do crime, the psychological elements. Everything is beyond you, that's the idea. Or in old Greek mythology, there were certain fates that made people do certain aberrant things. You're fated to do these things. It's all beyond you, right? So, all these together can be classified in one category, namely the tyranny of the context in which we are living. Now, many people say that we cannot be free because we live in dictatorships, but even when we live in dictatorships, even when the yoke of dictatorship seems to be poised right over our necks, there is still a huge universe of freedom that's possible, but freedom not of a political kind, but a freedom of a far more profound kind. And that freedom nobody can take away from us. So, people who are not oriented towards perfection remain victims of circumstances, and therefore you find universally, irrespective of the other conditions of life, most people would love to think of themselves as victims. In the Indian context, the Sangh Parivar, of which the BJP is the political wing, is the largest, strongest, wealthiest, most influential, most secure association, a political body in this country. But you ask members of this group, including members of the BJP, the political party, they will say we are all victims, victims of the minorities, victims of the minorities. Everyone is a victim. You ask any aggressor, he'll immediately cast himself in the mold of a victim. I'm a victim. Right? Now this clearly states something. The message is, look, I'm stuck in this stereotype of imperfection, and the only refuge I have is a refuge of victimhood. Please don't take that away from me. But let me tell you that that's not a spiritual option. Spiritually, there is no excuse. As Paul writes to Romans, now you have no excuse. I think this is something that Christians ought to repeat to themselves. Now you have no excuse. And Jesus has not only said be perfect, he has also demonstrated what it means to be perfect. He has also promised adequate empowerment in our quest for perfection, and therefore there is no excuse. Now, as I said, the power of perfection is that it can impact the material order of things and transform them, or unveil within them an order of possibilities that seems miraculous. So therefore, seeking perfection entitles us to peace, joy, and fulfillment. Not only that, beyond that, it also empowers us to be a blessing on humanity. A blessing on humanity. That should be our goal. That's precisely what Jesus meant when he said, you are the light of the world. You are the light of the world. How can that be if we don't pursue perfection? So there is a direct connection between Jesus' saying, be perfect even as your Father in heaven is perfect, on the one hand, and the next teaching, namely, you are the light of the world. The two blend together so beautifully. And my dear friends, I want to submit to you that if you're studying the Bible, particularly if you're studying the teachings of Jesus Christ, you have to study his teachings in their totality. Because every statement, every verse, every word connects to the other. one verse or one sentence by Jesus needs to be connected to the whole body of his teaching that's available to us. Obviously, all that Jesus taught is not available to us. As John says towards the end of his gospel, that's chapter 21, I think verse 30, if I'm not mistaken. He says, all that Jesus did and taught is not recorded in a gospel because it's impracticable to do so. But to the extent that's available to us, we have to connect one part with another because it's all part of the same wisdom of God. And if you therefore want to understand a particular teaching properly and adequately, you have to see it in relation to the whole of Jesus' teaching. So, we practice, as I said, we practice perfection selectively in the cosmetic context or in the worldly context, and that is cosmetic perfection. Now I want to talk about, and I'm going to conclude, talk about another aspect of the bogus or false or pseudo perfection we practice, and that's in the religious context. We practice perfection in the secular world and religious world, the profane world and the religious world, but it's a substitute for the perfection Jesus had in mind. It is not spiritual perfection, it is some other perfection. Now, some indications of the religious pseudo-perfection we practice. For example, when we pray, we make sure that we are in the most perfect state. The sentiments that we entertain, the feelings that we experience, the words that we articulate, the posture that we adopt. We are all saints when we pray. But the problem is that we are saints only when we pray. So, for that very brief duration, we are all perfect. Why? Because deep down we know, even though we don't understand the theology of it or the philosophy of it, we know that if we are to relate to God who is perfect, we have to be perfect. Therefore, during the time of worship, we try to be perfect. But perfection is not acceptable to us thereafter. Therefore, there is a very striking dichotomy or contrast or conflict or irreconcilability between our worship life and our ordinary day-to-day life. So that's one context. The other context is when we participate in rituals like the Lord's Supper, the communion, etc. Then we are in another world altogether. We are a different kind of people. Every individual is different to himself. Now, that is why Jesus always foregrounds or refers to hypocrisy in religion. This hypocrisy is imposed on us. It becomes a religious duty to be hypocritical. Again, it's a huge subject in itself. More of that on a later occasion. Now, while we are very particular about being perfect on these very limited occasions, we are absolutely indifferent to being this kind of people outside of the very brief religious context or the context of practicing religious rituals and ceremonies. And therefore, we lack consistency. And a personality that lacks consistency is bound to be weak, anemic. It cannot experience vitality. And that's the reason why, though as Christians we talk about the power of the Spirit, etc., we never experience it. The reason for it is here. If you want to experience the power of the Spirit, you have to be oriented to perfection. Actually, the Holy Spirit is a power or God's provision that empowers us to go along the pilgrim path to perfection. But we have turned the Holy Spirit into everything else other than this. And that is a distortion that we inflict on everything sacred. So, now let me address very briefly a further question that is raised in this context. And it's a very interesting question. The question is, if believers seek and attain perfection, will it not endanger Christianity? Of course, this question is not asked by every Tom, Harry and Dick. The question is asked by more discerning Christians. And so this question has been raised with me by only one or two individuals so far in my life, spread intellectual life spread over half a century. Why? Because to be dependent on a system, one has to be imperfect. Dependence and perfection can never coexist. And therefore, if individuals become perfect, it will undermine established religion, no matter which religion it is. And for this reason, therefore, friends, you will really see that every religious practice, the life of every church, and indeed every religion, is organized in such a manner as to prevent individuals from seeking and attaining perfection. The foremost virtue in the context of organized religion is not seeking but conformity. Conform to existing practices and patterns. Do not look forward, always look backward to something great that happened in the past. Something great happened in the past, who questions it? But life is not only lived in the past, it is lived today and tomorrow. And religion that is relevant to the world is a religion that also addresses human predicament today and the emerging needs of tomorrow. So, there is a built-in, ineradicable negativity towards seeking perfection in organized religion. This explains the conflict between Jesus and the Jewish establishment. Time is already now 36. I don't want to prolong my discussion any more than this. I have many more things in mind to say, but let me just point this out to you. Those of us who meditate on the cross, those of us who value the cross, at least we must remember that the cross is also a loud symbol of the irreconcilable opposition between individuals who seek perfection and the religious establishment that perpetuates individual imperfection so as to keep them in dependence and subjugation forever and to make them sources of income, the milch cows for the establishment to survive and to thrive. The spiritual growth of individual Christians is not the priority, not even a distant concern for any church whatsoever. All churches mind only one thing: the prescriptions, the practices, the customs of that particular denomination must be blindly accepted and practiced. All the responsibilities and obligations imposed on the members of the church must be faithfully discharged. And therefore, this religion of conformity freezes people in a state of inertia, deficient spiritual vitality, and robs them of the joy of fullness in life, evidenced by the fruitfulness of one's life, which, as I said, becomes a blessing on the world around. So therefore, there's a world of meaning that Jesus implies in the teaching, be perfect even as your Father in heaven is perfect. The question is it attainable at all? That depends on you. As I said, please don't mistake this idea of perfection. It is not perfection as God is perfect. It is perfection as God has designed you to be. God is perfect in God's own way. You have to be perfect, or you seek perfection. You seek the perfection of what God has seminally designed you to be. Every human being implies in his very birth or her very birth a divine intention. Seek the fullness of that intention, so that one's life becomes a constant reminder to others that there is a reality that goes far beyond the visible, material, empirical world, and that human life becomes complete only when there is a harmony between the physical, empirical life and the life that's beyond it, the life of the Spirit. And the harmony of all this together is what Jesus meant life in its fullness. So, the teaching, be perfect, is also the teaching, I have come that they may have life in all its fullness. Therefore, ultimately the question is not whether or not you should seek perfection. The question is whether or not you want to experience life in all its fullness. Thank you for your patient attendance.